First story up today is Afghanistan. And last week around Thanksgiving, we had a report from the World Bank that they were working on a $500 million aid package for the people of Afghanistan. And this money was going to come from the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which has a total of $1.5 billion. So it's not like they're breaking the bank to get this money. It's a third of the funds, but it's not everything. And that this isn't like additional aid that the US is going to have to fork over. It's already money in the Afghan account. Now, since the Taliban took over mid-August, obviously the World Bank, because of US sanctions, hasn't been transferring really any money to Afghanistan. And generally, I don't think very much aid has gotten into that country. Of course, there's some cross-border trade that's happening through either aid or economy. I think the UN figured out a way to pay some people, particularly medical workers, to work, but generally speaking, no aid has gotten to the people of Afghanistan. And we've now gotten to the point where we have an absolute unbelievable crisis in Afghanistan. And we are just now, 4 months out of the US being in control of that country. For my libertarian listeners, they'll really understand exactly what I'm saying. We basically popped one of the, proportionally at least, probably the biggest bubble of a country in history. So much of the wealth and everything that was happening in Afghanistan was coming in either through US money, military aid, or through US allies in aid that way. And so once the Taliban took back over and the US sanctions on the Taliban essentially now applied to Afghanistan as a whole, zero money has gotten into that country. And so yes, there is some wealth that gets produced in Afghanistan. They can produce products and trade, and this makes it so that there is some goods getting into Afghanistan still. However, not a whole lot, because so much of what was happening in that country was being imported, and a lot of that is because the US war has destroyed so much of that country over the past 20 years, and conflict over the past 4 decades in that country, largely fueled by US intervention, just using the Afghans as cannon fodder to weaken the Soviets during the 80s. One last thing that even this article puts out is that the largest problem is the U.S. sanctions at this point. And so that was last week. This week, well, I guess right at the end of this previous week, we got a report from Reuters saying that the World Bank was now had a plan to use $280 million in those funds to help the Afghan people. So they've essentially cut the aid package in half. And since it seemed like the hangup for the old aid package was U.S. sanctions, you had to wonder if the package got cut because of U.S. sanctions. Now, what this new one is going to do is it's going to transfer the funds from the World Bank to the World Food Program and UNICEF. I believe that we will find out exactly what's going to happen this coming week, because everybody who donates to the fund, I guess through the World Bank, the way the mechanism works, has like a veto power over it. And of course, a big donor, maybe I think the biggest donor to the Afghan fund, is the Americans. And so if they choose, they could veto this aid package. So, we'll see what happens. Reuters went, try to talk to the Treasury, and the Treasury didn't, give an answer on whether they were going to allow this or not. So, we're still in limbo here. But one thing that gets pointed out in this article is that the Treasury says that they provide comfort letters, which what a phrase to use, right? But anyways, they'll send a letter to whatever bank, some Chinese bank or something, saying that you won't face U.S. sanctions if you are providing basic supplies, food, medicine to Afghanistan. Now, what happens is, let's say that the people are providing basic supplies, but the U.S. labels some of those supplies as dual use, like masks or, upgrade masks, something like that. Well, now, rather than, you complying with U.S. Sanctions and not getting hit with sanctions. You're going to get sanctioned because that item is labeled dual use. And so many people just stay out of trading with any group, any country that is sanctioned by the U.S., like the Taliban, Iran, Venezuela. They all report having trouble getting in medicine because of U.S. sanctions. And the U.S. always says, hey, we allow medicine to go in. And the problem is that they label so many items as dual use. And the U.S. is so fickle about things and is willing to sanction just for political gains to look tough to the U.S. audience that nobody really wants to trade with the with the country sanctioned by the U.S. because you risk being sanctioned yourself and having your business destroyed because of it. So that may happen. I think right now they're saying that 22.8 million of about the 40 million Afghans are going to face acute food insecurity this winter. Now, I don't think this means, like some people are interpreting this as this many Afghans will starve to death. I don't think that will happen. I'm not trying to downplay it. I think there's going to be intense suffering, and children will starve to death in Afghanistan this winter because of what the United States has done. I just want to be careful not to be alarmist on it. And, looking and seeing how the predictions have been made in Yemen in particular, and not that I necessarily think that people are trying to be alarmist and hyperbolic all the time, but there are things that happen where let's say no food gets into a country. Well, that doesn't mean everybody's going to starve to death, even if there's no like traditional food. People boil leaves and grass and get some there are ways to find some calories, even if it's picking through trash, eating animals that typically wouldn't be eating, mice, rats. And there's other risks to that, of course, but it does change the numbers of people and the magnitude of people starving to death. So I'm sure the number will be in thousands. It'll particularly be the children under 5 in Afghanistan who end up, dying this winter because of the U.S. sanctions and because of the lack of food. But I got some pushback on the last time I covered Afghanistan. Somebody said I was trying to downplay it, and that's definitely not the case. I think this is horrific. And look, even if you have all the children in Afghanistan live through the winter barely getting any calories, that severe malnutrition is going to stunt them and impact them for the rest of their lives in very serious ways. We're not talking about something minor here. Oh, kids will just be able to eat leaves and find a couple squirrels over the winter and that'll get them through everything, and that's going to be okay. Just getting through this winter, especially again for the children under 5, this is going to affect them for the rest of their lives. It'll affect Afghanistan for the coming generations. The fact that the U.S. is maintaining these sanctions and not just providing Afghanistan with aid after, again, we popped the biggest bubble in their country and just absolutely ruined it. All right, so there is, I believe, a separate proposal from the UN, and I don't think that this is relying on the World Bank funds and is coming from a fund that was started by Germany and has about $170 million in it, although the UN is looking for $300 million. And what they're calling this is a direct cash payment program. It's going to be through the UN Development Program, and I think they're calling it like cash for work. And so I don't know, that just means pay. That it's a really weird slogan they're using for this. But I think the idea is to try to not accrue U.S. sanctions and not risk violating U.S. sanctions by paying Afghans to, work in the medical field or whatever. And so, this is something important here, right? That prior to the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, a lot of, people who were providing what I think in a lot of countries would be seen as typical government services, even if, I don't know, like schools, hospitals, stuff like that, were actually run by international aid agencies, or at least the employees were paid by international aid agencies and not the central government. And so again, so when the UN left, or once the US left and sanctions applied again, all those jobs and all that money like froze up. And so all these people, haven't been working, or at least haven't been getting paid for the work. And, this is closed schools and medical facilities, which obviously compounds the problems. But I guess the idea here is that if the UN is able to pay the people directly, then this is going to make it so that the US sanctions don't apply. Hopefully, this does work out and they do get Afghans some money. Although, again, this does raise kind of a big question for me, which is, why exactly are the Afghans starving? In Yemen, it's because there's a blockade of the country, and because they don't produce a lot of their homegrown food, and a lot of their homegrown food production has been targeted by the Saudis in the air war against that country. And so it made sense that there's not enough food to eat. In Afghanistan, they keep calling it a currency crisis. And it kind of suggests to me that the problem is they don't have enough money. Like, the Afghans don't have enough money, but there's products to buy. And if that's the case, why don't the products, the price of those products just come down? And while maybe there's some temporary lag in the market that's going to cause some little bit of suffering or something like that, that should start to equal out at some point. It doesn't seem like that is happening. And so it could be that the US has just propped up so many corrupt people in Afghanistan for so long that the rich there's such wealth inequality, with the people who have gotten rich off the US government have so much and the other people have so little. I'm not sure, but it seems very odd that everybody's saying that the only problem in Afghanistan is a currency crisis and not a crisis of goods getting into the country as well. So there is, I think, $8 billion in Afghan funds that are held by the Federal Reserve. And this was the account of the old Afghan government, right? And so prior to August 15th, there was an account at the Fed that, the Afghan government could access whatever they wanted, no problems. And this is how they ran the country. Well, now that the Taliban have taken over, the Afghan government no longer exists. And so there's $7 billion sitting in the Fed. And the people who are now the government of Afghanistan are sanctioned by the US, the Taliban. And so there's, real questions on what's actually going to happen with that money. And there are people in the US trying to get their hands on it. There was a settlement awarded by a judge years and years ago, and I'm not sure if that judge actually intended for that settlement to ever be awarded or if it was more a symbolic thing. But I believe billions of dollars were awarded to some of the victims of 9/11 families. Not all of them, but some, which are ones who brought this particular lawsuit, and it was awarded against the Taliban. Now, I think there's factual problems with this. Like, you can maybe look at the Taliban and partially blame them for 9/11 because Osama bin Laden was hanging out in their country. But if you looked at where 9/11 was actually planned, the United States, Germany, Malaysia, Pakistan, if you look at how much control the Taliban actually had over Osama bin Laden was very little, and all this, then I think it becomes hard to say that the Taliban are on hook for billions of dollars to the victims of 9/11. Also, it does seem like kind of a large settlement payout. Now, there is another complicating factor, and that is there is a group of, I'm not sure if they were maybe injured contractors or the families of killed contractors, but there was a group who won a $138 million judgment against the Taliban because of was called a terrorist attack in Afghanistan. I really don't know the details of it. However, I don't know, like, if you're a military contractor and you go overseas and something happens, I don't know if you could sue the group that did it to you. That seems I don't know. I mean, warfare is warfare. It's brutal. It's ugly. And, one of the things is justice always doesn't get done in a war. And so this seems like a pretty absurd contract. And also, if it does go through, I could imagine there's going to be a lot of other people, other lawyers thinking that they could bring lawsuits like this against the Taliban for crimes that have been committed in the past 20 years. Now, really interesting. What would happen, let's say an Afghan woman wanted to sue because the U.S. airstrike blew up her children or something like that. I bet she wouldn't be able to really have standing in a U.S. court or get more than a couple $1,000s from the U.S. government. So those are the people seeking money, I guess, not within the U.S. government. Of course, I have highlighted on the show in the past how Congress is absolutely going crazy. They're drooling over themselves, seeing this pot of billions of dollars and wondering what they're going to do with it, trying to give the Ukrainians some of the money and weapons and everything. But the Biden administration, I guess, report to Charlie Savage here at the New York Times that it has kind of a three-pronged approach they want to take. And they say, number one is that some of the money should go to the settlements, and that they don't want any money going to the Taliban. And so I'm not sure what the order is going to be there, how much money they're going to want to give to victims of terrorist attacks and everything like that. But they're saying that they do want some of the money to go there, and that they don't want any of the money to go to the Taliban. And then they also said that there is a issue along with like some people who were victims of 9/11 who didn't get any kind of compensation that they want to give some of this money to. Again, maybe there does need to be some justice done from 9/11, but I think there's other places to look from this fund. And then finally, the last thing they're looking at is to make sure that a little bit of this money, I guess, does go to some aid, but it's not exactly clear to me what's happening and how much money is going to go to aid, especially because, again, the Taliban are in charge and there's so many U.S. sanctions against Afghanistan. It's pretty rare for the U.S. to give meaningful aid to a country that it is so cruelly sanctioning. Also, part of the U.S. sanctions is to make conditions in those countries so unlivable, so terrible, so brutal that people will overthrow their government to get out from under the sanctions. And so the U.S. goes and provides a whole bunch of aid to the Afghans. Then, that'll alleviate some pressures on the Taliban. At least this will be the logic of the U.S. government, and make it less likely that the people will overthrow the Afghan government or overthrow the Taliban, which is, I'm sure, their goal, because they don't want to ever recognize the Taliban's legitimate government of Afghanistan. So these are a lot of the issues that I'm seeing here, and just the way we're all handling this is really gross. There's starving people in Afghanistan. Let's help them out. Now, there's a couple reports out of Afghanistan from the mainstream media that I did want to mention quickly that I'm skeptical of for a couple reasons. The first is there's reports, and I think this is coming from Human Rights Watch in particular, that the Taliban are putting together a campaign of, retaliation against former Afghan government officials. So this is something that we've talked about on the show. Andrew Quilty, who and Scott Horton interviewed a couple months ago, did talk about there were some reprisal killings going on, although to him it didn't seem like there was a systematic aspect to it. And so it could be this, where, again, as I've talked about the whole time, I imagine there's going to be plenty of cases where people are going to attempt to, either justly or not, address grievances from the past 20 years. And so if, the commander of the Afghan government's forces in your village was particularly cruel and terrible and was maybe involved in, the child rape that was going on, or was just, corrupt and cruel, if people go out and kill that person, well, I mean, that's not justice. It's not great, but at the same time, it's kind of to be expected, and not something that maybe a central Taliban plan would have a whole lot of control over. That being said, maybe as we do get further and further away from the Afghan government being in charge and the Taliban feeling like they have more control, they are going to try to exact some reprisals against people they could feel be potentially dangerous in the future. Apparently, the U.S. is really pushing for the Taliban to really enforce like a blanket amnesty, which I don't think will happen, and honestly probably shouldn't to some extent. There are plenty of people within the Afghan government who committed war crimes over the past 20 years, and just giving them amnesty isn't really justice either. Although I'm sure the Taliban coming and killing you in the middle of the night, doesn't count. And then the other thing was CNN is now reporting that little 9-year-old girl that they reported was sold to become a child bride has been rescued by an aid agency. Again, I remain a little bit skeptical of this story. It does seem, that she was living with her family. She went to go live with another family. My question is more around what she's what her intent was, and according to Afghan sources, it was more of a collateral situation, and where she was essentially going to work like as a maid in the house that she was working at, because the family had taken out so much debt from the person to feed their family in the past, or I don't know, blow them. I have no idea what the family was doing with the money. They could been doing heroin or something for all I know, but assuming that they're using the money to feed their family and everything like that, it's a really unfortunate situation. And it's not like these type of things didn't happen in other parts of the world ever, and it is drastically different from selling a 9-year-old girl into an arranged marriage or sexual slavery or something like that. From the actual reports I seen in the mainstream media, it doesn't seem like there was any allegations of sexual abuse, and apparently the PR from like the deal was so bad that the families just worked out that she wasn't going to be used as collateral, and the family would just have to pay back the debt. Again, this isn't a pretty situation, but it is caused by the United States, not the Taliban. And I guess, again, I do think it's a little bit different than CNN is reporting it. All right, a couple other stories on Afghanistan quickly. The U.S. and Taliban had talks last week in Qatar. The new U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, Thomas West, was there to meet with the Taliban. Of course, Zalmay Khalilzad, the man who orchestrated the actual deal and everything, a longtime neocon, is now out, has resigned from that position. So I don't know much about Tom West, and it will kind of, I guess, figure out as things go on. I didn't hear anything about these really talks as a result. Doesn't seem like anything's coming from them. As I mentioned on the show, I believe last week or 2 weeks ago, the Taliban, for whatever reason, seemed kind of optimistic about the talks. I thought that was kind of misplaced, in that I think was the case. It doesn't seem like any kind of deal got done, or we got any closer to freeing up funds for Afghanistan relieving sanctions. There's a really interesting article in the Wall Street Journal called "Taliban Covert Operatives Seize Kabul, Other Afghan Cities from Within." And it kind of goes over and it gives a couple, anecdotal details and everything like that. But just in general, what happened here is the Taliban are saying, and there's some evidence of it, that what's happened over the past 20 years, or I guess probably a shorter amount of time than that, is several members of the Taliban have deeply embedded themselves within the Afghan government. Now, this article kind of mentions that they're a part of the Haqqani network, which sometimes I think there is like a legitimate difference between the Haqqani network and the Taliban, although they're close allies, but the Haqqani network is somewhat of a different group, and I think more advanced and more capable. But at times the U.S. just goes, oh, the Haqqanis, I think as a way to try to. The Taliban really isn't scary to the U.S. as much anymore, and Haqqani sounds more mysterious and everything like that. So sometimes I think this is used as propaganda. I'm not sure in this case, but there are reports from Afghan people who say that there were these people who worked for the Afghan government, were clean shaven, walking around in jeans, and then the Taliban took over, and what do you know, now they're growing beards and walking around in Taliban robes and have guns on and everything. So it does seem to some extent this was happening. In some cases, it seems they, got people into these positions. So whatever vetting process the Afghan government was using failed. I guess they figured, hey, Taliban aren't willing to wear blue jeans and shave their chin. And so that means if this guy comes in blue jeans and a shaved chin, he's good. I'm not exactly sure, but they let people who were members of the Haqqani network, according to this article, take up influential posts within the Afghan government. And then there was the case of people who are members of the Afghan government, for whatever reason, either greed, corruption, or like maybe they legitimately became disillusioned with the Afghan government or bought into Taliban propaganda. But, there have been people in the past 20 years who worked for the Afghan government. They went to the Taliban. They said, hey, I want to join you guys. And what the Taliban have been doing is turning them around and saying, like, okay, like, great, we want you to be a part of us and everything, but what we need you to do is stay where you are. Now, these people are even in important, like influential positions where they were able to influence students or other people within the government to bring them over to the Taliban side too. So I guess there's a couple things here. The first is this really doesn't surprise me. And if you hear what, Scott Horn has kind of talked about, a coup de main where the Taliban essentially were there in Afghanistan and all over the place and just announced themselves present. And that's how they took over a good chunk of the country. I think this adds to that narrative and further support for his argument. But another thing that it does is highlights the unbelievable U.S. intelligence failures in Afghanistan. The fact that so many important posts of the Afghan government who were probably being paid salaries by the United States just simply were members of the Taliban in a disguise all this time. How could that possibly be the case? How could the CIA, which was all over Afghanistan, the Pentagon, not know and understand this? A huge portion of the economy of Afghanistan was coming from U.S. tax dollars. All those bribes didn't leave you on to this massive plot that allowed the Taliban to take over the country in just a couple of weeks. It's absolutely stunning. And I guess it does kind of go to and add to, why I was talking about with like the drone strike in Kabul, that, while we say we have all this intelligence on Afghanistan, everything like that, we clearly didn't and had no idea what was going on in that country. One last story on Afghanistan. Not a real big surprise here, but there's a bunch of Afghans that are living in various places around the world: Albania, Chile, Uganda, Kosovo, etc. And they're increasingly having trouble like getting their visas processed and everything like that. And it says now that some of them could actually wait years before they're able to come to the U.S. Again, this doesn't surprise me. I think that they're going to fall into like a weird limbo state where they're not actually in danger, right? Like if you're an Afghan living in Chile and you might not be living in great conditions, you might not be living with your family, you might not be living where you want to live, but you're not in Afghanistan, so they're going to say that the Taliban can't hunt you down and kill you. And then so you're not a priority for that reason. But then too, you're not in Afghanistan where if the U.S. Congress passes any programs or anything like that, it's probably going to prioritize those people or people in the United States. And so they're going to end up in this weird limbo where they could really just spend years in other countries, and who knows what's going to, happen during that time and how their lives are going to develop. All right, let's